Morning. I'm going to be doing a talk this morning on Joshua 7 and 8, carrying on our series in Joshua. I've entitled it Victory After Failure. I found a really good resource on the internet that's helped me prepare for this, and I hope that you'll get something out of it as we go through what I've prepared. I'm very conscious of three things this morning as I've prepared throughout this week. Firstly is the obvious current situation with coronavirus in our nation and in our world, where life has been altered for us and in our day-to-day lives. Things have changed. Daily lives are different to what they are normally. The second thing is that we're studying this series on Joshua, and it feels a little bit disconnected with the experiences of today, with our current experiences with the coronavirus, and there's perhaps a slight disconnect with them. And the third thing is that it's Palm Sunday today, an interesting day in terms of history and significance in the story of Jesus, and how within a week Jesus goes from being this national treasure to someone who is used as a scapegoat and even seen as an enemy of the state. So Palm Sunday being quite important in our Christian calendar. And I've tasked some of the children to come up with some palm craft activities, so hopefully we'll be able to see some of those on our WhatsApp pages in the near future. And these are three strands: the coronavirus, the studying of Joshua, and it being Palm Sunday. They're not easy strands to try to tie together, and in most part I'm not even going to try, except to say that the truth is that God is the same in every one of those situations. He is just, he is constant of love for each of us then and now. So as we face this coronavirus crisis, as Joshua faced the battles that he had in the Bible, and as Jesus faced his certain death, like right in the face, God has been the same then and is the same now. So in all of these aspects, I want us to consider what type of lives we could or should be living when we call ourselves followers of Christ, and what it is to be holy. I've got two verses that aren't in Joshua that I want us to think about, and we're going to come back to these as well. In Leviticus 11, verse 44, it says, "I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore consecrate yourselves, and you shall be holy, for I am holy." And in 1 Peter 1, verse 16, it says, "Be holy, for I am holy." And that is going to be the basis of where we're going to get to at the end of this 15 minutes or so of me talking. Okay, so back to Joshua 7 and 8. I'm not going to read both the chapters. I think you're perfectly capable of being able to do that yourself. I'm just going to précis it and use the parts that I'm going to draw out for this whole aspect of what God requires from us to be holy. So in Joshua 7, we find that the Israelites have just enjoyed their great victory in chapter 6 of the walls of Jericho falling and the city being destroyed, and the Israelites finally entering into everything that God has promised for them. It's a fantastic story about how God enabled a disobedient and malevolent city to be crushed with the use of musical instruments. Joshua was faithful in everything that God told him to do. And their next job in chapter 7 was to take the city of Ai. And this should have been a much easier, lesser job. But it turns out that they got defeated. The Israelites got defeated. And this was totally unexpected. Joshua's reaction was to go to God, which is good. But he started ranting. He tore his clothes. And he started saying, "Where were you, God? Why did you send us there if we were going to be defeated? Don't understand. What have you done to us? Look at the victory. We should still be in all of this victory kind of situation." God's response to Joshua, and I can see kind of in my mind's eye, especially as you've got an exclamation mark there, he pretty much says to Joshua, "Get up. And what are you doing? Get up." No, you didn't follow my guidelines. You didn't stick to the plan. Okay, so God gave the Israelites a set of kind of guidelines, instructions of you take the city like this, you do this, you don't do this. And one of them was not to take any of the riches out of the city. It didn't belong to them. The Israelites didn't need them. They were to leave it alone. They got instructions for that. And where Joshua's thrown himself on the ground and he's ranting a bit, God's kind of, okay, get up, let me explain. The Israelites have sinned. They've not kept this particular instruction. They've been disobedient. So where Joshua thought it was all the God's fault, it was actually one of the Israelites not following the instructions. And that man's name was Achan. And this part of the story in chapter 7 could be subtitled Achan's sin. Okay, so what was Achan's sin? Because what he did was he took a couple of bags of gold and a nice silver cloak back to his tent for himself and perhaps his family. Okay, so what was his sin? Was it greed? Just plain right, I want that for myself? Was it arrogance in the sense that no one will know because he buried it and tucked it in under his tent? But mainly, and the point of this is, it was disobedience. Achan disobeyed God, flat out, right, did it his own way, stepped out of God's plans and purposes, stepped out of God's instructions and sinned. And at this point, it should get us thinking about, well, when we sin, it is about stepping out of God's intent for us, God's will for us. And God always has a reason for setting guidelines and instructions for us to follow. Okay, God is not a God that asserts his power just for the sake of it. Okay, he calls us to be obedient not as a dictator, but because he knows us. God created us, and we know that. And he knows us better than we know ourselves. So in Psalm 139, it's all about how God knew us before we were even formed in our mother's wombs. In Matthew 10:30, it talks about him knowing the hairs on our heads, every single one of them. And in Jeremiah 29, it talks about God having plans and purposes for us for our best, so that we can live the most fulfilled lives. And we often, as humans, and all of us can hold our hands up to this, can say sometimes we don't actually follow what God's saying. We think sometimes we know better, or perhaps we don't spend enough time listening before we make a decision, or perhaps we just plain get it wrong sometimes. But when we step out of God's will for us through disobedience, through literally going, no, I know better, it is pretty much foolishness. But we do ourselves harm, and we do others harm too. So where God sets that sense of you need to follow what I'm saying here, you need to be obedient here, and therefore become holy, it's for our own sake. He knows best. Okay, he knows the best for our lives. He knows the bigger picture. So where we would go one way, he knows the bigger picture, that even though it's hard to go another way, he knows best. I think of Jonah in the Old Testament, Jonah and the whale, where God said, I want you to do this. And Jonah went, no thanks, and nicked off completely in the opposite direction. And in that instance, God literally went after him and took him back to where he should go until Jonah said, all right then, Lord, I'll do it your way. And then great things happened as a result. So it is foolishness. And when you look at things in hindsight, perhaps, or, someone else talks to you about their decisions, you can see it. Sometimes when you're working it out for yourself, it is that much harder. But plain disobedience, literally saying, well, no, I'm not going to do it that way, I'm going to see what I can get away with, is plain foolishness. And for Achan, he lost his life due to this disobedience. He was stoned. He was taken out of the community of the Israelites, out of the situation that he was in, and his family. All his cattle and belongings were taken out as well and destroyed. And he lost his life. He was stoned. So he literally lost his life. And but not only that, it cost his community a defeat, which wasn't planned or necessary. So there are two things in there. Now, we think about when we're disobedient these days, when we talk about sin, we're obviously, next week, we're going to celebrate the fact that Christ came for the very purpose of dying, what we celebrate as Good Friday, and rising again on Easter Sunday, on the Sunday that we celebrate it. And he did that for the sole purpose that we have a relationship with God, that we no longer need to be tied down by our sin and our disobedience. And when we do make mistakes, when we do step out of that, maybe do the things wrong, take our own path, act out of our own will rather than God's, There is always a way back. Okay, the grace of God and what Jesus achieved on the cross gives us that way back to God. Achan didn't have that opportunity, but we do, at time after time after time again. But in this whole call to be holy, this whole thing that we're focusing on today, the point is that we don't take advantage of that grace. Our call to be holy is to be obedient to God. And when we are obedient to God, then we are getting the best, God's best for us in our lives, even though it might look a bit weird. Okay, so Joshua in the next chapter has to hold up a javelin. It's a bit weird. Moses had to do some weird and wonderful things. We don't necessarily understand it. It might look a bit different. It might all fit with the norm. And actually, in Romans 12, it says, I appeal to you, therefore, by the mercies of God, which is your spiritual worship, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So basically, our spiritual actual worship, a day-by-day walk with God, should be that we brush off the things of this world. They don't do us any good in the long run. They might have that kind of sense of immediate gratification, but we know that a relationship with God is for his glory, but for our eternity as well. We want to do the will of God. We want to stay obedient and holy, not stepping out of his will. So by the grace of God, through what Jesus achieved on the cross, we can know that on a daily basis. So as we think about Holy Week, perhaps this week, our challenge is to reconsider how God has saved us. Without Jesus, our disobedience of God is our death. We don't know life to the full if we don't have a relationship with God. We don't have a way to have a relationship without Jesus, and we don't have the enabling power and authority of God without the Holy Spirit. There is a stark warning, coming back to the second part, that it cost his community. Achan's sin cost his community. There was a defeat there. I think there was 30-odd people, Israelites, actually killed when it should have been a sure victory. There was a cost to the community. They couldn't understand the defeat when God had promised them all of the victory. So our call as individuals to be holy is obviously for our own walk with God, to be obedient and holy and pursue God for the best that he's got for us. But it has a corporate effect. It has an impact on others. So consequences of my sin might affect my family or my friends or my church. And I don't know about you, but when I think about that, I don't want to be the reason why somebody else stumbles or the church doesn't make progress in a certain area because my sin is holding it back. God can't bless necessarily where there is sin. There is a separation from God, and the sin needs to be dealt with before we can actually then pursue him for the victory. Okay, so what we've looked at in our very short time together is that there is God's loving guidance or guidelines to our victories. Okay, holy obedience in our understanding that God is for us, has perfect plans and knows what we need and when, is his loving guidelines to the victories in our lives. That there can be victory after failure, that we can rest on the grace of God and go back, and he loves to be able to meet with us, even if it is in forgiveness over something. He loves that we go to him in that place. So secondly, the other thing that we've looked at is the choices we face on earth daily and ultimately, and what we use as our guidelines to get these right. So using the Bible verses that I've suggested and looking at the Bible for guidance on how to be obedient, how to be holy, how to pursue the things of God. We've then thirdly looked at the rewards of obedience. And the rewards of obedience is holiness, is a closer relationship with the God who loves us beyond anything we can ever know or imagine. A fulfilling relationship with that God through Jesus Christ, and understanding and living in victory on more and more occasion. And then last of death and separation and defeat, perhaps. So there's a prayer that I would like to share with you. Hopefully I would like you, your homes, mine, this particular prayer, okay? And it says, Jesus, mighty conqueror, only by your grace can I live by your word and walk by your spirit. The moment I lose confidence in you, step out of your will and take matters into my own hands, I begin to lose ground. The consequences can be devastating, for you tolerate neither compromise nor disobedience in our holy presence, in your holy presence. Thank you, Holy King, for your desire to purge my life of everything that is contrary to your will and purpose, so that I might share your victory each day here on earth and your glorious relationship forever. So hopefully you will have enjoyed what we've looked at this morning. Do read the 2 chapters. Do also think about looking in the New Testament, the verses in Romans and the verses in Peter about being holy. And bless you this coming week as we lead up to our wonderful Easter weekend, my favourite weekend to celebrate in the Christian calendar. And God bless you all.